A mosque bombed in Sudan, the latest atrocity in a conflict that's caused the world's worst humanitarian crisis, says the UN. A new US-led political initiative gets a cool response from Khartoum. What's happening in the conflict and what hopes for peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Sudan's conflict continues to rage, causing the world's worst humanitarian crisis in just 2.5 years. Now, fighting between the Sudanese army and paramilitary rapid support forces has forced around 13 million people from their homes, almost a quarter of the population. A UN report released on Friday cites frequent war crimes, including sexual assault and ethnic violence. The UN says 40,000 people have been killed, but other estimates are higher. It also says the conflict has caused the world's worst famine in 40 years, as well as outbreaks of diseases. Various political efforts to end the violence have failed. And earlier this month, the US launched another initiative along with Saudi Arabia, Egypt and the UAE. So what is happening in the conflict, and are there any hopes for peace? We'll discuss all of this with our guests. But first, this report from Amgad.
There's no safe place for civilians in Fasher. Last week, the paramilitary rapid support forces carried out a drone strike on a mosque, killing more than 70 people. The city has been under siege since May last year.
We continue to receive reports of civilians being killed, abducted or subjected to sexual violence while attempting to leave Fasher. There are no safe exit routes out of the city, and civilians are trapped in a situation of impossible choice. Either stay in Fasher and risk bombardment, starvation and atrocities if the RSF overrun the city, or flee and face the risk of summary execution, sexual violence and abduction.
It's the last remaining stronghold of the Sudanese army in the Darfur region. A recent UN report says killings of civilians have intensified and that ethnicity is increasingly a motivating factor. It found that in the first 6 months of the year, more than 3,000 civilians were killed, mostly in Darfur, by artillery shelling and drone strikes in densely populated areas. The report also found that at least 990 civilians were summarily executed. The RSF and the army have been battling for control since April 2023. The conflict has killed tens of thousands of people and forced more than 13 million from their homes. Their suffering is the result of a dispute between former allies, Army Chief and de facto head of the government Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and RSF leader Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, on how and when to integrate the paramilitary group into the armed forces. After fierce fighting earlier this year, the army said it had retaken the capital, Khartoum. In April, the RSF set up a rival administration in areas under its control, large parts of the south and most of Darfur. There have been several attempts to try to end the conflict. The latest is a joint initiative by the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. The so-called Quad group of nations proposes a 3-month humanitarian truce, followed by a permanent ceasefire and a 9-month transition to a civilian government. The government has criticised the Quad, however, saying that while it welcomes efforts to end the conflict, it would not accept interventions which it says do not respect Sudan's sovereignty and its legitimate institutions. Far from the politics, millions of people face a near-daily battle for survival. The violence has brought famine to parts of the country and caused what the UN describes as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Amgad, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guests now. Amgad Eltayeb is the Executive Director of the think tank Fikra for Studies and Development. He joins us from Cairo. Kholood Khair is a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of the Confluence Advisory, a think tank formerly based in Khartoum. She joins us from New York. And Cameron Hudson is a senior associate in the Africa program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. He joins us from Durham in North Carolina. Thank you so much for being with us here on Inside Story. Kholood, could I begin with you? I mean, it's very clear from everything we see and hear coming out of Sudan that the civilians are paying the heaviest price here. What does daily life look like now for those that are caught in the middle of all of this? Because there really are no good options for people at the moment.
Absolutely so, unfortunately. I mean, what we're hearing from sort of partners on the ground, family, friends, civilian networks on the ground is that, almost regardless of where they are in the country, life has gotten precipitously worse. Of course, for those in places like Fasher, but also places like Adilinj, and Kadugli in South Kordofan, famine, which has been declared there, means that life is just that much more harrowing on a daily basis. People are forced to eat, animal feed. They're forced to, spend lots and lots of money, to just get the simplest of grains and sometimes in very minimal amounts where they are available. And for those who want to, for example, flee or leave the areas that they're in, for example, chiefly in Fasher, there are no safe routes for people to leave. And so it becomes a very desperate situation where there are frankly no good options anywhere. But even in areas that are, for example, deemed much safer, inflation has gone through the roof. And so we're seeing food insecurity levels increase in those areas as well. And we have seen very little provision of rule of law. We see armed gangs have taken root in places like Khartoum and in the southern parts of Khartoum leading towards Jazeera. We have seen greater instability in most parts of the country, because of course, as this war continues, it mushrooms into becoming ethnic warfare, it mushrooms into becoming a fight between multifarious groups of on either side of this conflict, and it mushrooms into becoming something else entirely than what it was 2.5 years ago.
Amgad, 500 days of war, more than 500 days of war now. As we heard there, that this has mushroomed into ethnic warfare as much as anything else. How do you assess where the war is right now? Because it really just feels like it is in a stalemate with no side really making great advances at this point.
Yeah, and this is happening for a reason. The crisis in Sudan is not just conflict. It's a crisis of facts and truths. You mentioned 13 million displaced people. Those 13 million were not displaced because of a natural reason and were not displaced randomly. These people flee from the areas controlled by the Emiratis-backed RSF militia to the government-controlled areas. You also mentioned, or my colleague Kholood mentioned, the famine in Eltayeb and Kadugli and Fasher. It's not famine. It's not happening because of drought. It happened because the starvation that deliberately used as a weapon of war by the RSF, which for 18 months preventing food and aid to be delivered to Fasher. It's deliberately made epistemological maze in which facts are being lost, and this preventing the crisis of being resolved in any way. And this brings me actually to the drone attack that took place 2 days ago by the RSF, when we saw tweets of condemnation from the UK and from the US that talks about victims who fall. Like those victims fall because of a natural disaster. Those are victims of the RSF. Those are victims of the RSF bombing a house of worship, a mosque during a prayer. What's happening in Sudan right now is blood laundering. It's not just complicity. There is an attempt to whitewash what the UAE and RSF are doing in order to reach a political settlement that includes addressing the interests of UAE and RSF at the expense of the blood of the Sudanese people. Without solving this epistemological maze and calling a spade, I think we are very far from reaching any solution for this crisis.
Okay, we'll get on to the regional players and their thoughts in just a moment. But Cameron, we heard there about this man-made famine that is obviously making everything so much worse for the Sudanese people. From Washington's perspective, why are donors cutting aid at exactly the moment that Sudan really needs it the most. Do you think it's simply about fatigue after 2.5 years of war, or do the governments actually seeing this as all of a bit of a lost cause at this point?
Well, I think there's a bigger question there about why the United States government is cutting aid, and unfortunately, I think the people of Sudan are the casualties in that, but they are not the cause of the United States cutting its aid. This was a global decision made by the Trump administration, which is having obviously deleterious effects on the people of Sudan, coming at a critical moment in the span of this war. But it's affecting other countries in different ways. But the fact of the matter is that the humanitarian appeal for Sudan has been underfunded since the day the war started, and that's not due to the United States. As a matter of fact, the United States remains, despite all of its aid cutbacks, the largest donor of humanitarian aid and humanitarian assistance to Sudan since the start of the war. But that's not saying much, because the donations from the UN and from member states have been paltry compared to other conflicts in the world today, but also related to Sudan 20 years ago, when there was a genocide in Darfur, or prior to that, when there was the largest airdrop operation to feed people in the Nuba Mountains during the North-South Civil War. So there's been a long history of very generous giving to the humanitarian causes in Sudan, which we have just not seen since the start of this war. And I think the reasons for that are manifold, and we can debate them, and hopefully people will debate them in New York this week when world leaders assemble. But the fact of the matter is that there is a dire and desperate shortfall right now. As Kholood said, people are dying of famine and starvation and preventable disease right now, surely in numbers that rival anything that the battlefield deaths might be putting up there. So I think we have to focus first and foremost on the humanitarian situation. It is the most solvable, it is the most treatable of all of the ills that plague Sudan right now, and use the opportunity to build on that to try to develop some kind of ceasefire mechanism going forward.
Kholood, it seems like there are two issues here when it comes to aid. The lack of funding, or the cuts in funding for aid, and also the lack of access, the lack of ability to get it to those people who need it most. Can you just run us through the ramifications of that combination specifically? And like Cameron was saying, what the solutions could potentially be here?
Sure. I mean, it's a very toxic combination, and the people of Sudan are falling foul of it, but it's a sort of a global issue, as Cameron had said. The reason why this confluence of adverse factors, affects Sudan right now is because, it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. It's the largest displacement crisis in the world. It's the largest hunger crisis in the world. And it's the largest protection crisis in the world all at once. And that makes the lack of attention, the lack of financing that much more galling. So we have seen, for example, the Sudan Humanitarian Fund only 25% funded in the world's largest humanitarian crisis. This is in part because the US has withdrawn some of its money, but it's also because other countries have taken that as an excuse to also do the same. A lot of countries are actually putting a lot more money into defense than they were previously putting into aid. And that has caused a sort of a reverberating impact on Sudan. So what we need to see is countries step up to the plate, specifically on this humanitarian issue in Sudan, because as Cameron said, actually, this is the most solvable, particularly for the United Nations, which is unable to play a similar role in other global conflicts. But when it comes to the access issue, you have now effectively, operationally, two governments, one in Port Sudan and one in Niala. And both of those governments are making it extremely difficult to gain access. The United Nations largely takes its cue from the Port Sudan government. And when the Port Sudan government says, you are not allowed to deliver aid in Darfur, they usually, very much follow that order. The Niala government works in a different way. They try to stop aid from going to places they don't want it to go, specifically right now in Fasher, and they try to divert aid as much as possible to areas where RSF constituencies are, places like Eltayeb and places like Niala. So what we're seeing here is a textbook Sudan security state diversion of access story, and also a story where sovereignty is being asserted through the denial of access. process. Now, what the United Nations needs to do is create a compact with international organizations, donors, and those mutual aid organizations on the ground to say, we will go where the need is most, where the humanitarian imperative far outweighs access constraints and issues of sovereignty. Because if we continue down the road we're in right now, a lot more people will die because of this man-made famine, regardless of who is causing it. And frankly, we cannot afford to sacrifice the lives of millions of Sudanese people at the altar of political machinations.
Yeah. Amgad, if you can just pick up on that point. I mean, I believe that you've argued in the past that the real issue really isn't simply more aid, it's ending the war once and for all. Can you just explain why focusing only on humanitarian assistance actually risks missing the point here?
It's the same crisis of facts and the same epistemic myth that's being causing the political crisis is causing the humanitarian crisis as well. When my colleague here talks about two governments, one in Khartoum and one in Nyala, she knows very much that the core definition of the government is service provision. And when she says that Port Sudan government is preventing aid from delivering to Nyala, I will just refer her to a week ago that the WFP declared that their trucks are ready to go to Fasher and the RSF is preventing them. This is the same epistemological crisis when talking about the signification of the war, and the war is turning into a ethnic fight, and in attempt to find a justification for the RSF for its war. There is a crisis. There is people dying, and there are people like Kholood and others who are trying to settle political scores by talking about things that does not exist. Fasher is under siege. Kadugli is under siege. There are besiegers in this siege, which is the RSF. If the world is really serious about delivering aid, there is airdrops, which actually the international community used to do in 2017 and 2018 without even waiting for permission from a sitting government at the time, which was the government of Omar al-Bashir. But right now, it seems impossible for them to do it. Right now, what we see is that the whole world is complicit in using this humanitarian crisis to settle political scores because they are avoiding confronting the RSF and by proxy confronting the UAE that enables the RSF to continue doing what it's doing while enjoying this institutional impunity by talking about two governments, talking about the two parties, talking about prevention of aid of going to Darfur. Port Sudan government, as she said, since the beginning of this war, have allowed every cross-border to remain open. How many aid trucks have crossed from Adri, which was actually a demand from the humanitarian organization. This justification of the lack of interest and the lack of capacity and the lack of political will to deliver the political aid is participating to the creation of this political crisis.
Okay, I want to bring in Cameron now, if I can. We're talking obviously about outside regional influences in all of this. I know in the past you've called this war a self-perpetuating folly. Why do you think that both sides have kind of settled into a bit of a stalemate at this point in time, and what is actually going to get them out of that? And can you just explain how the other regional partners might actually play a part in doing that?
Well, they could play a part in doing that, but they're also enabling this stalemate. I think that, to some degree, this war has become a lot easier for both sides to continue to fight. If we think back to 2 years at the start of this war, there were pitched battles. I mean, I can remember seeing, video clips of pitched battles on the streets of Khartoum, on the streets of major cities of the country, going block by block, house by house, close combat operations by both sides. Today, people are sitting in Nyala, they're sitting in Port Sudan, they're flying drones over El Fasher, they're flying drones over other major cities in the country. They're fighting this war remotely right now. It's lost the kind of operational tempo that it had, and as a result of that, the vast majority of casualties are civilians, and they're not military officers, they're not RSF officers, and so when the cost is lowered to both sides in this conflict, for carrying out this war. And when they maintain their network of outside supporters who are willing to finance this war, who are willing to continue to funnel weapons and provide political support for this war to continue, then I think we're in a very difficult position. And I think the Quad statement that was referenced already, that came out this week, I don't think it was a serious statement. I don't think any of the statements that we have seen from the international community recently have been serious. And it's because they have been appeals. They have been appealing to the warring sides to stop this fighting, to engage in a humanitarian pause, to engage in a ceasefire. But there are no consequences being imposed on the parties for a lack of engagement, right? There are no consequences. There is no sort of tough line. These are warring parties that will respond to strength, that will respond to a united front. And we are not showing, the international community is not showing strength. It is not showing a united front. The sanctions that have been imposed recently have been laughed off by the parties, probably as they should have, because they're not serious. So again, I think that the parties to this conflict are taking their cues from the international community. If we are not serious about trying to bring an end to this conflict, which we are not, then why should they be serious about laying down their weapons? I think that is the overall message. And my hope is that something can come out of New York this week to change that messaging. But I doubt that there will be that message.
Yeah, you're referring to the UN General Assembly that is happening over the next few days. Kholood, I saw you nodding along there to this Quad plan between the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I mean, there's been much criticism since it came out. Do you think there is any credibility to it, or is it even viable? Do you think it is strong enough?
I don't think it's strong enough, and I think that the reason why we saw support, almost immediately from the African Union, from the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is a regional body in the Horn of Africa, as well as the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is because this is finally something that is moving on the Sudan file, and therefore there is some level of engagement with it because it shows momentum. But Cameron's right, unless it shows a level of seriousness in terms of how it's going to back up some of what it's putting on the table with action, it won't be taken seriously neither by the warring parties in Sudan, nor by those who signed it, who sort of are part of it themselves. These are, sort of UAE, Saudi, Egypt. The concern here is that it's trying to put some level of constraint on the Sudanese parties. It is saying, for example, that the Muslim Brotherhood should not be part of any political dispensation. It's saying that neither SAF nor the RSF should feature in a future political dispensation in Sudan. But it's not circumscribing to any great extent what the role of these foreign actors are. It's not, for example, saying the United Arab Emirates should not be sending weapons, or the Egyptian armed forces should not be running aerial bombing campaigns in Sudan, etc. It is not saying, for example, that the Saudis should not be supporting the financing of aid, military aid and weapons from, let's say, Pakistan. And so if it doesn't put any confines on these actors, and which we have known to be bad actors in Sudan, who do not want civilian rule, who do not want democracy, then how can we take that statement seriously?
Cameron, you've argued that Washington's best bet is to try and corral Egypt, the UAE and Saudi into pushing for peace. Do you think that those countries actually want a democratic Sudan, though?
Well, again, I think it's hard to know exactly what they want, and I think what they want has changed over time. What they want and what they will settle for and what they can achieve, I think, are not all the same thing. The fact of the matter is that that even though there's been a statement that says, for example, that we should end foreign military support for this war, we know that one of the signatories of that statement has continued to funnel arms and weapons into the conflict since signing that statement. So, if the people who are signing these statements are not living up to the things that they have committed their country to, then again, why should the parties to the conflict be serious about taking up their offer for a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause? There's a sort of laughability factor to this that really can't be taken seriously right now. I think we've all established that there's too much profiting going on from this war. There's a war economy that has set in. Both sides are being able to sustain this conflict in a serious way. And there's been no conversation about any of the mechanisms that might slow down this conflict, whether that's a true UN sanctions program, whether that's an arms embargo that is expanded across the country, whether it is forcible steps taken by the United States or other European allies against the UAE or against other countries that might be fueling this war. And we've seen very little diplomacy from the West, to go in and to talk to the parties in this. And so I think none of the hallmarks of the way international engagement has occurred in Sudan to end previous conflicts, because remember, we have a lot of experience diplomatically engaging to end conflict in Sudan. None of those hallmarks that we have seen in the past 30 years of peacemaking in Sudan are present in this current conflict. So something has to change if we hope to make any kind of progress.
Amgad, I want to get your final thoughts on the Quad statement in particular, because neither the Sudanese army nor the RSF should be in a future government, according to that statement. I mean, is that realistic at all? Who could possibly step into that vacuum? And do you believe that there is a diplomatic solution here?
I think to decide who stays and who become in the government is something, in the Sudanese government, is something for the Sudanese to decide. But I think there is a very big problem with the Quad, which is the presence of UAE on it. Sudan have declared UAE as a hostile country, and UAE supports the continuous support and supply of UAE to the RSF with weapons and even mercenaries and political and financial support is something that have been proven several times. So you cannot claim right now that UAE can be part of the solution and even impose their conditions on how to reach and satisfy their interest in Sudan. For Sudan needs a proper political transitional process, but this happened after the war stops, after the active fighting stops. And UAE is right now part of this active fighting. So they cannot actually help in stopping it. If they are really serious about ending the conflict of Sudan, let them at least put pressure on their proxies, the RSF, to stop the siege on Fasher and allow some aid in. So basically, the international community need to stop talking and act more in meaningful manner.
Kholood, we've only got a minute or two left, so I want to leave the final word for you. What do you believe is going to happen in the months ahead, heading towards the end of the year? I mean, are we going to see famine continue to spread and conditions get even worse for the people of Sudan?
It's not looking good precisely because of the dynamics that Cameron spelled out. I mean, the UN General Assembly is taking place next week. I don't have any hope that Sudan will feature very heavily. But even if it does, I don't think any concrete action will come out of it. We have seen this every year since the war started. And what we're going to see from October onwards is the dry season, which means any lull in the fighting that we've seen in the past few months is going to disappear. And more of the ground assaults that we expect to happen are going to start playing out. We're also going to see all the weapons that have been bought over the rainy season over the past few months being put into full display. Right now, there's a prevalence of the use of drones, partially because some areas are intraversable, there's flooding, there are rains, etc. But we're going to see that uptick again in the level of ground fighting, particularly around the Kordofan area in the dry season. What I'm most concerned about is the dengue fever, the cholera, and the starvation. That is, we're definitely going to see increase if nothing changes on the humanitarian access front and if no further funding comes through, as currently it looks likely.
Yeah, dire consequences for everyone there in the months ahead. Thank you so much, Kholood, Cameron and Amgad. We really do appreciate your time and your insight today. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.